Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tanzu for Beginners. We had a different name for this session first, but we got a bit sensitive about a particular brand that's out there that might take offense. So Tanzu for Beginners. My name is Robert. I work for ITQ. We are an independent VMware consultancy in the Netherlands. And my focus at ITQ is the Tanzu portfolio, quite broadly. And today I'm going to take you on a little journey through it to hopefully enhance your understanding of what Tanzu actually is and what VMware's approach to this whole Kubernetes thing is. So why Kubernetes anyway? As you may have noticed, application development is changing. Containers have become a very, very popular way of deploying code. And Kubernetes has become the de facto orchestration platform around containers. These Gardener things, you keep seeing them in all these slide decks, but we can actually see it happening with our customers as well. There's a lot of interest around containers. A lot of development groups are playing with containers, are playing with changing their application deployment strategies and their build pipelines to use containers, and to orchestrate all of those containers, they'll need something. Kubernetes has become the tool to do it, and VMware has taken note of that. But why is VMware involved with Kubernetes at all? So VMware's whole deal was, of course, for the longest time, VMs. Now they've added a lot of additional products to their portfolio, but kind of the core thing that made VMware successful and many companies and ecosystems around that is, of course, the virtual machine. And VMs were a revolution in how effectively and efficiently we could use physical server hardware to get workloads deployed. But like I said, containers are now becoming the preferred way of packaging code. And this changes the equation a little bit. It changes the emphasis. What we're seeing is that IT infrastructures are going to orient themselves more towards how to deploy code in the form of containers. And there's going to be more emphasis there. There's going to be more attention on that than on the VM, which up until now, for most of us, is still the kind of the main management thing, the thing that we're used to managing. In a way, containers can be seen as the threat to VMs. I don't think they are. I think VMs are still the way to go when it comes to managing instances of servers, instances of operating systems. So I think containers are complementary to VMs. But if the basic management block is going to be containers on top of VMs, then it makes sense that VMware starts getting into that game, because VMware, of course, is concerned with helping us manage and orchestrate the enterprise IT environment. So if containers become a huge part of that, and it seems like they will, it makes sense for VMware to be in that game. And VMware, of course, has a huge presence already on premises amongst many companies. It is the most popular and the de facto virtual machine software running on premises. So it's very logical that they would step into this area, and they've committed very heavily in this area. Gone so far as to integrate Kubernetes into vSphere itself, into their core hypervisor component, the thing that made them big in the first place. So that's a pretty big deal. So just in case you're still wondering what the hell the word Tanzu means, I copy pasted these from a bunch of VMware slide decks. Tanzu is not one thing. It's a portfolio of products. The whole point of this presentation is to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what that portfolio actually is, what it has. Tanzu is not just Kubernetes. It's a bunch of stuff around it. And VMware have always done more than just the thing that made them big, right? The virtual machine. They've always been interested in the life cycle around virtual machines. So they have they already had a wide portfolio. Tanzu now it gets added to that portfolio, and Tanzu is in itself also its own portfolio of products. And VMware likes to categorize this stuff into the build, run, and manage framework. So also the Tanzu products are aligned down these same categories. Now, an interesting thing is happening around VMware when it comes to Tanzu. It's not just Tanzu, but it seems to have accelerated with the adoption of Kubernetes and the stuff around Kubernetes. And that's that VMware is getting very heavily involved now in open source software, where they weren't as much before. And that's caused some, it's causing some interesting things to happen. The whole container revolution is more or less driven by the open source community. Docker, Kubernetes, all the projects around Kubernetes that are kind of encapsulated in the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, the CNCF, they're all open source projects in one form or another. Many of them are commercially backed, as is often the case with open source, but it's very much a community and a kind of a bottom-up push. And this is how Docker got popular. This is how containers got popular. So in order to get into this game, you have no choice but to adopt many of these open source tools, many of these open source technologies that are being spawned from these various open source projects. So VMware, has to get involved in that, and they took an interesting approach to do that. They, of course, put a lot of engineers in these open source projects, but they wholesale bought a bunch of commercial companies that were already very heavily invested in the Kubernetes ecosystem. So we're talking about companies like Heptio and Bitnami. And they recently reacquired Pivotal, who was originally spun out of VMware to focus on kind of the top end of what is now the Tanzu stack, the very developer-focused ecosystem around the Spring framework and the various tools and offerings that came out of that, things like Pivotal Cloud Foundry and Pivotal Container Services. So they've reacquired Pivotal, they've acquired all these other companies. It's given them a huge foothold into the open source community in one kind of big swoop. So it's impressive to see how VMware suddenly became a big kind of player in all of these open source projects, including Kubernetes itself. They have a huge presence there, and they're all over major parts of Kubernetes in its core. So in order to get into this game, you need Kubernetes, but you need a bunch of tools and software around Kubernetes. And Tanzu is basically that. It is the collection of a whole bunch of software, open source and closed source, bundled together, integrated in a specific way, which we call opinionated. So VMware has made some choices in which tools they use, how they do the integrations. The whole point of combining all this stuff together is to be able to offer a managed Kubernetes solution for the on-premises world, but not just on-premises. They would like to have Tanzu run everywhere. So why do you even need a managed Kubernetes in the first place? I mean, isn't Kubernetes just something you download and install? Well, kind of, yeah, but Kubernetes is still hard. Kubernetes itself, it used to be really hard to install Kubernetes. There is still, you can still do it manually if you want. You can follow Kubernetes the hard way. And then you'll kind of get a good insight into how Kubernetes works on the inside. And I recommend everyone does that at least once. Installing Kubernetes itself is no longer really hard. There's a bunch of frameworks out there now that let you very easily get a Kubernetes cluster up and running. Minikube is probably the most popular example if you want to start messing around with Kubernetes. But what I'm referring to is that Kubernetes is hard in a different way. It's the stuff around Kubernetes that is still hard. It's all the stuff on the right side of this slide. Kubernetes itself is just software. It's just the thing that orchestrates the containers. But you need a lot of stuff around it if you actually want to enable applications on Kubernetes. Now, unless you've actually started to build an application on top of Kubernetes, you might not be aware of all of the stuff you need. But I can tell you that Kubernetes in and of itself is not enough. So you need a strategy, and you need to combine a lot of different bits and pieces in a stack together in order to actually have a scalable and available and deployable and lifecycleable, if that's a word, application. And this is why VMware made Tanzu. And VMware's not the only one doing this, right? Red Hat OpenShift is another example of opinionated managed Kubernetes offerings that take a lot of this integration work away from you, and they basically they've thought it up, they've integrated it, they give it to you more or less on a platter and say, okay, use this combination, we've vetted this, we've validated this, this works, and here's how you install it. So the attempt is to make all of the stuff on the right side of this slide simpler to get started with. So when you kind of take all of these different subjects and you start ordering them, you kind of end up with this. This is my own categorization. VMware themselves in their slide decks have a very similar breakdown, actually, but mine is a little bit different. When you map the Tanzu portfolio to these categories, you end up with this. This is the Tanzu portfolio as it is today. In fact, this slide contains a little bit more detail than just the products. What I've attempted to include in this slide is all of the little bits and pieces, well, the most important open source projects that are essential in the Tanzu portfolio as it exists right now. The stuff at the bottom of this slide should be familiar to most vSphere admins, right? vSphere itself, VMware Cloud Foundation, which includes vSphere and NSXT and a whole bunch of other stuff to really get up and running quickly with a data center. They add on to that, of course, their Kubernetes runtime, which they call Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. But then you need all this other stuff to actually to get going. Now, you don't need all of it immediately. Some of this stuff, if you want to start doing a proof of concept with Kubernetes in the flavor of Tanzu, you don't need all of these things on day one. So VMware have very helpfully made various suites that can combine different parts of this picture, and we'll get to that in a second. Also, as you can see in this slide, a lot of it's just open source projects, which means that that you can actually go and run the bits and the binaries yourself. You can the projects are completely transparent, but there's also some proprietary stuff in here. Some of the blue boxes are SaaS services that VMware offers through their VMware Cloud. Tanzu Mission Control is a great example of that. Tanzu Observability, which used to be called Wavefront, still called Wavefront, is another example of an acquisition they did, which runs as a cloud-based SaaS offering. And what you see in the Tanzu portfolio is that they take an open source project and they'll add stuff to it. They'll extend it. They'll make it even more useful, and they integrate it with the rest of their stack to give that extra value. So, like I said, you won't need all these things on day one. Right now, amongst the customers that we have, we're seeing a lot of proof of concepts being run. A lot of people experimenting with Kubernetes, hello world, my first Nginx deployment, stuff like that. But some of our customers, they're moving beyond that now, and they're starting to deploy production workloads on Kubernetes. And changing the way you develop software and changing the way you deploy software, changing your pipelining, and then the platform underneath, whether it's Tanzu or something else, starting to manage that at scale, starting to manage that as infrastructure. That infrastructure as code requires different skill sets. It requires a culture shift within developer groups, but also within IT departments and companies generally. This takes a lot of time. The concepts involved in doing modern applications, doing what they also call cloud scale applications. It's a different way of thinking about application architecture and about infrastructure architecture. So this takes time. So we and VMware see this as a kind of a customer journey. And one of the things that we do as a company is we help customers on this journey. We try to advise them as best we can. And VMware, of course, they have the same. When they reacquired Pivotal, they got their hands back on something called Pivotal Labs, which is now called Tanzu Labs, which is a really great collection of consultancy services that can help customers on exactly this journey of starting to rethink how they do application deployments. VMware have made it really easy to get started. They've taken the basic Tanzu Kubernetes functionality and integrated it with vSphere to make it very easy to adopt by current infrastructure teams that already know vSphere. But then you can carry on through this journey and get more and more advanced as an infrastructure team, as an application team. At some point, you're probably going to want kind of a DevOps team or platform team to start filling in that role that sits kind of in between developers and infrastructure. We see with our customers that really is a specific role, and if you kind of see the kind of the terminology, the roles that both Kubernetes community talk about and VMware increasingly talks about, they talk about the DevOps role or the platform engineering role. So to make this journey kind of easy to start with, they've taken all of these Tanzu products, all these bits and pieces of Tanzu, and they've put them into different suites. Now we're familiar with this suite idea, right? vSphere, Enterprise Plus, the vRealize suite. VMware likes to package up stuff because it's easier to sell, obviously, but it also makes sense from this journey perspective. You can start small and you can just ramp up as your skill sets increase. You can ramp up the complexity and you can start adding products that you're going to at some point feel the need for, things like more advanced observability tools, more advanced monitoring and logging. Once you start building more than just a few Kubernetes clusters, managing kind of a fleet of clusters becomes a thing. So that's where Tanzu Mission Control comes in. So As you can imagine, VMware have kind of spread out the functionality over these different suites. Right now, Tanzu Basic, Standard, and Advanced are out, and Enterprise is on the way. And we'll go into detail of the differences between Basic, Standard, and Advanced a little bit later in the slide deck. But before we do that, let's dive a little deeper into Tanzu Kubernetes Grid itself. So this is the core technology that VMware have developed to make it easy to deploy and manage and lifecycle Kubernetes clusters at scale. There are not that many solutions out there right now that can do this. There are a few. And of course, the public cloud providers are already very good at doing exactly this kind of stuff. But on the in the on-premises world, this is still a bit of a trick. The Kubernetes community, the Kubernetes project, saw this one coming. They've enabled Kubernetes to be able to spawn versions of itself. This is the Cluster API project. You use Kubernetes to manage Kubernetes, basically. It sounds a little bit like Inception, but the reason behind this is that Kubernetes is a very extensible control plane in and of itself. It was made to manage and orchestrate containers, but the control mechanisms that are built into it are actually very good at managing all kinds of stuff, not just containers. You manage other Kubernetes clusters with it. You can even manage VMs using it, or external products like databases and things like that. So in many ways, Kubernetes is a universal control plane. And what you're seeing with Tanzu, but also with other projects, is that people are finding very interesting ways of using Kubernetes and its declarative model and its control system and its built-in reconciliation loops to control and to build and to manage all kinds of stuff. So Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is VMware's use of the Cluster API project, and they've added a bunch of stuff on top of it and around it. They've also made a dedicated CLI tool that you can use to spawn additional Kubernetes clusters, to upgrade them, to lifecycle them, to manage the configuration of them. And this you could see this as a kind of a framework, and it's not in and of itself. It's not dependent on vSphere. It can run independently of vSphere. It can run on any EAS, right? So you can run on Amazon. It can run on Azure. The framework in of itself it simply needs an EAS to run on. The first thing you get with Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is a management cluster. The form of that management cluster kind of depends if you're doing it on vSphere 7 or not. If you're running Tanzu Kubernetes Grid on vSphere 7, then you're probably going to use the version of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid that is already included in vSphere 7, which we call vSphere with Tanzu. And there you get a management cluster as well, but there the management cluster is already embedded in ESX. Now the whole point again of this framework is to be able to spawn Tanzu, to spawn Kubernetes clusters, and you have the choice of which Kubernetes version is being spawned. The different versions of TKG support different versions of Kubernetes, and these are completely what they say conformant Kubernetes clusters, as in they are the way they're configured is according to the specifications laid out by the Kubernetes project. So they are, it's native Kubernetes, and that's important because if you have a Kubernetes management solution that can spawn conformant clusters, you should be able to assume certain things about about the way that Kubernetes works. It makes the applications you develop on top of Kubernetes, it makes them portable between different instances of Kubernetes. Now, I already touched on it. There is this version of TKG, which is included in vSphere 7, which they call vSphere with Tanzu. There are some interesting differences between the standalone version of TKG and the version you get with vSphere with Tanzu. For one, it takes care of a lot more stuff for you. So you can kind of see it as a wrapper around TKG. They've added a whole bunch of stuff to vSphere in the UI as well that makes it easier to use TKG and easier to visualize. Kind of the point is to make this easier to get started with, to make it more understandable to vSphere admins. It adds a bunch of options that you wouldn't have in the standalone TKG. For example, if you have NSXT, and if you have VMware Cloud Foundation, then you'll have NSXT. Then you can actually add NSXT to these clusters that you're going to turn the Tanzu function in, where you're going to turn on this Tanzu function. And NSXT will integrate with the control plane of this, the Tanzu Kubernetes management cluster. And this enables some extra networking and security functionality around that management cluster. Because it's integrated in the vSphere UI, you can also kind of see what's going on. The objects that Tanzu builds, mainly other Kubernetes clusters, show up as objects that you can manage inside the vSphere UI. Another cool thing you can do is you can actually manage this kind of fleet of Kubernetes clusters in namespaces. You can assign resources to them. These namespaces work very similar to resource pools. They're kind of a version of a resource pool. So you can also control which developer teams are allowed which resources on your vSphere environment quite easily through this integration. So we already have identified kind of two flavors of TKG. This version that's kind of integrated in vSphere, and the standalone version that can run on any cloud. But in the current lineup, there's actually three flavors of a managed Kubernetes offering. Because remember when I said they'd reacquired Pivotal? Pivotal had already developed their own managed Kubernetes offering called PKS, Pivotal Container Services. And many of our customers still run this and run this quite successfully. I don't know if today you could still order PKS, but it's the actual kind of on the ground reality is that there are now more or less 3 different Tanzu Kubernetes profiles to run. The older but more mature, I would say, Pivotal Container Services, now called Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Integrated Edition, TKGI, which it works very, very differently from TKG. It uses a completely different stack of technologies. And then you've got these 2 deployment profiles that we've already discussed around TKG itself. This kind of standalone version, sometimes referred to as TKG multi-cloud, hence the TKG-M. And then you've got the version that's integrated in vSphere. And if you see a slide that mentions VCF with Tanzu, it's basically VCF plus vSphere with Tanzu included. It's the same thing. Now, like I said, with vSphere with Tanzu, the management cluster, kind of the core thing that that makes up all of the guts and the clever code of TKG, the engine that can spawn additional Kubernetes clusters, runs in this management cluster, and it's called the supervisor cluster if you have it embedded in vSphere 7. You can actually run your own workloads in that cluster if you really want to, but it's not recommended. What's recommended is that you use that cluster as the control plane. That's kind of the basic function of it. And then when you actually want to start running your own container deployments, that's when you spawn your first Tanzu Kubernetes cluster. Those are the green blocks in this slide. A Tanzu Kubernetes cluster is the thing that you spawn from TKG. It's it's the first place that your users will actually use to deploy Kubernetes workloads on. And underwater, these are all just VMs, but they're being created by this TKG engine. But in the end, these are just VMs. Now, it's different if you run workloads inside the supervisor cluster, which I would not recommend for most use cases. There, a Kubernetes container will actually run natively on ESX. Now, this is what is kind of still known by a lot of people as the project specific thing. But it's actually not the core use case for TKG. Right now, the recommendation is run your stuff in a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster. Sometimes you'll see these clusters also referred to as guest clusters or workload clusters. Kind of depends who you talk to, but the point is that those clusters are the place where you're going to run your actual customer or your own container workloads. Now, VMware has in their documentation, they have a great picture that kind of shows these two modes. On the left side of the slide here, you'll see what it looks like kind of when you're running both VMs and certain workloads natively in ESX. And then on the right, you see what happens when you start deploying these Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. So they're just groups of VMs that form Kubernetes clusters that will spawn inside these vSphere namespaces. And so these are the two possible nodes. But like I said, the recommended mode right now is on the right side of this slide. Now I keep reemphasizing that point, and I have a whole slide dedicated to this because people still remember Project Pacific quite well, the original announcements now about 2 years ago. One of the things that the people tend to remember is that, oh, we can run containers straight on ESX now. Well, yeah, but like I just said, that's actually not recommended to do for most workloads. But that's the thing that people still remember about that original announcement. So we've had to maybe walk one or two customers back on this to say, well, hold on, that might not be the best place to run your workloads. Let's start with creating a dedicated Kubernetes Tanzu Kubernetes cluster first and run your stuff in there. And that whole reason again is about conformance. The Tanzu Kubernetes clusters that you deploy are completely standard Kubernetes clusters. That means that there are no limitations really. You can run anything in there. The native pod version, the deploying workloads in the supervisor cluster, will work for a lot of workloads, but there are some limitations around that. There are also some advantages, certain security features that you can make use of in SXT, and there are some use cases around pinning workloads to specific ESX hosts for performance reasons, but we're talking about exceptions. Now, we'll get back to the Tanzu Editions. I had to emphasize this difference between these deployment profiles before we can talk about the editions, because what you get in the different editions kind of depends on how you deployed Tanzu to begin with. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I apologize for that. I mean, you'll have access to all these slides after the fact anyway. Like I said, they've taken all of these different functionalities in the form of different tools, open source or closed source, combined them into these suites. But the equation gets a bit more complicated depending on if you, for example, have access to NSXT, because NSXT is an extremely powerful bit of software. It can do a hell of a lot, and they've made good use of it while integrating it with Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. As you can see here, if you have NSXT, it can do a lot for you around load balancing and ingress when it comes to containers. Now, if you don't have NSXT, a lot of people don't, there are plenty of other options on the table. And what we're seeing is that VMware is currently still playing around with the balance here. You know, which tool is being used for which function, in which edition, under which circumstance. So we're seeing some changes happen there, even very recently. So there are a lot of options. I've made this slide to make you aware of the complexity of the picture currently, but also to help maybe clear it up a little bit for reference. So this first slide, there are two slides that basically look like this. This first slide basically shows you all the core networking stuff around containers and the different choices there. A recent addition, something that was that's kind of new in TKG 1.3, is the integration of this NSX Advanced load balancer. That's another acquisition. That's the Avi load balancer, and it's very powerful and it's very useful. It's taking the place of various products, various other tools that were in this picture before. So as VMware is integrating these tools and developing them further, this picture is likely to still shift and change and be updated. Here you kind of see the difference when it comes to Advanced. Advanced just adds more stuff out of the portfolio. So it adds the Spring Runtime, it adds more stuff around building containers, around managing container images, manage Helm charts, things like that. It starts to add Tanzu data services to the mix in the form of VMware Tanzu SQL, which is a managed version of Postgres and or MySQL, supported by VMware. It adds things like Tanzu Observability and Tanzu Service Mesh. So remember remember the maturity, remember the customer journey. So this is kind of the play. As you get more advanced in what you want to start doing with Kubernetes, once you start noticing your need for say service mesh type functionalities, that's when Tanzu Standard starts becoming very interesting. And some of the most interesting integration VMware has done is kind of on that Tanzu Advanced side. And that's because of Tanzu Mission Control. Tanzu Mission Control is being positioned as an absolutely fantastic kind of global management plane across not just Tanzu Kubernetes flavors, but kind of any Kubernetes flavor, but specifically for the Tanzu ones, because they're integrating it in all these different ways with a lot of the different tools in the portfolio. I would say that eventually, if you get very heavily invested into building application architectures in Kubernetes on top of Tanzu, then Tanzu Mission Control is going to become equally important as vSphere is to an infrastructure admin. So there's a lot of development going on there, and it's looking very powerful. So I'm kind kind of ahead of myself in time because this was basically it. There are some takeaways I want to give you. Kind of the core thing to kind of keep in mind is that this is still pretty new stuff. It's still maturing. It's in development. They're still fiddling with lots of different parts of it. I would say it's already usable, but bear in mind that things can change and will change right now. Of the three different managed Kubernetes offerings we have, the two different profiles for Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, and then the older, more mature Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Integrated Edition, the former pivotal PKS. PKS is the more kind of the stable one, right? That's the one where it's pretty rock solid, has very, very good N6T integration. In fact, it depends on N6T. You can't run it without it. So we're in an interesting place right now when it comes to these managed Kubernetes offerings. There's a lot of choice, right? You can actually, depending on which, in our case, we have customers, and we can pick and choose which flavor and which approach currently works best for which of our customers. So that's actually a nice position to be in. Another key point is that while Tanzu makes managing and deploying Kubernetes and the stuff around it easier, it does not make it effortless. You still need to skill up. You still need to get a handle on Kubernetes itself and a lot of the tools around it. Things like Helm, Git, right? You need to manage this stuff as code. So you need to understand how to do managed code. You need to get familiar with Git. But many of the ways you manage this container stuff requires tools and approaches that you might not be familiar with if you're coming from an infrastructure background. And while Tanzu makes it easier, you still need those skills. You still need to understand what's going on behind the scenes in order to troubleshoot, in order to deploy, in order to customize. So that's kind of my main message. VMware is doing a hell of a lot to help us in this, like VMware fanboys and engineers. There's a hell of a lot of training and training material and documentation out there, and the quality of the documentation is getting better and better. A year ago, I would have said something different, but it's really maturing on that side. So I think VMware is doing really down the right path to make this stuff manageable. But it's a long tail. So not every company is going to invest in developing software in containers immediately. Lots of companies don't do any software development at all, right? So this stuff might not even be relevant to many current infra admins or people familiar with the VMware software as it is today. But we are going to see containers really become a thing within enterprise IT. And I'm really excited what VMware is doing here. So that's basically it. I see a bunch of questions, which I'm going to tackle. But thank you for your attention. I hope this was useful. All right, let's have a look. Let me just pass these questions before I start answering them. So so Jonathan Copeland's making some good comments. It's not really a question, I think. Yeah, but yeah, that's a observation about how these application architectures, how microservices, the modern application architecture is basically a microservices application architecture. So a point he's making is that, and I totally agree with him. Many applications will not be container only. Many will be a combination of stuff running on VMs and running in containers. Some of these VMs, they might not even be application code, but there'll be things like backing services, centralized services that parts of the application architecture will depend on. Typical example is things like databases. Right now, you can deploy VMware's Tanzu SQL solution as a Helm chart in Kubernetes, but you can also run it as a bunch of managed VMs, as a tile in Ops Manager, which is a kind of one of the things they inherited from the Pivotal reacquisition. So depending on the use case and depending on the application architecture, there are lots of different choices here. And yeah, not everything will end up as containers. The interesting thing here is that in order to figure out the best match, you have to talk to developers. You have to start understanding stuff around the application architecture. And these are conversations that we're having with customers every day now, where you can't just treat the VM as a black box anymore. You actually have to understand what's going on, so you can help development teams make the best use of the infrastructure by making the best match for them or helping them make the best match. Lots of comments, some very nice comments. Thank you, guys. Which are the options you get with Enterprise Plus? Well, that was before I think I showed the Editions comparison. Yeah, so I don't know anything about licensing this stuff. I know there are different editions, but there are all kinds of interesting SKUs and ways you can license these things. You can get add-ons. I have no idea about any of that. So I speak to your VMware account executive about that. What about certs? Yes. Again, Jonathan, good question. CKA, CKD. So the Cloud Native Compute Foundation has, together with the Linux Foundation, made a number of standardized Kubernetes certifications. There are 2 right now. I think there's actually going to be 3. I think I heard something about that. The 2 that are out there right now are the CKA, so that's the Kubernetes Kubernetes Certified Administrator. Yeah, and then there's the certified application developer. So there's 2 versions. I would absolutely go for the certified administrator one. It gives you a very good foundation around all of the basic Kubernetes concepts. And there's some great learning material around that. I would very much recommend the stuff that Nigel Poulton makes. Nigel Poulton has an excellent set of courses around. They're on Plural sites. They're also on a different service that he helped found. He also has some excellent books. They're all written from the perspective of someone who has a vSphere infrastructure admin background. So he makes a great bridge between the world that many of us will know and this new world. Udemy also has a brilliant Kubernetes course, which Udemy does great deals, so you can usually get them really cheap, but it's actually really high quality. And VMware themselves have such a ton of stuff to get ready for the CKA exam. There's the Cube Academy, which has some excellent stuff on there now. And yes, there are. So VMware is also developing courses, official courses and courseware around these skill sets. I'm not very familiar with what they have right now, but I know there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline. Nigel Poulton, Jonathan. So just Google Nigel Poulton. In fact, maybe I can stick it in the chat. But he's just one of several people that have put some excellent Kubernetes learning material out there. Okay, let's see, any other questions right now? I think we've covered that. Okay, well, if that's it, I think we're going to leave it there. I want to thank all of you for your time, and I hope this was helpful. And well, hope to see you all next time.